The call came on a Tuesday morning and I almost didn't answer it. I was in the middle of a deposition, 12 years of building my career as a paralegal, and I still got that flutter of anxiety every time a senior attorney's voice went flat and quiet in a conference room. My phone buzzed on the table, screen down, and I ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. I stepped out into the hallway and saw the area code, 423 Eastern Tennessee. I hadn't seen those three numbers in 11 years. My aunt's voice on the other end was careful, the way people get careful when they're about to deliver something they've been rehearsing. She told me my father had passed. Heart attack. Sudden. And then, after a pause that stretched a little too long, she said the funeral was Saturday. She said she thought I should know. She didn't say I should come. I stood in that hallway for a long time after I hung up. The carpet was this industrial gray-blue, the kind that exists in every office building in America, and I stared at it until the pattern blurred. 11 years. I had not spoken to my father in 11 years. I had not been back to Harlan County in 11 years, and the last thing he had ever said to me was that I was not his daughter anymore. I was 22 when he said it. Let me back up. My father was the kind of man who filled a room just by walking into it, not because he was warm, but because everyone immediately understood that he was the one deciding things. He'd been the county assessor for 16 years. In a place like Harlan County, that's not just a job title. That's a network of favors and files and people who owe you something. He knew what every piece of land was worth, who was behind on their taxes, who needed a quiet word and who needed a not-so-quiet one. People called him by his first name, Wayne, but they said it with a particular deference, the kind that has a little fear mixed in. My mother was different. She was soft where he was hard, patient where he was quick. She kept a garden in the back of the house and played hymns on a second-hand piano every Sunday morning, and she loved me in that quiet, steady way that doesn't announce itself. I knew she loved me because she showed up. Every school play, every bad grade she helped me study through, every night I had a nightmare and found her already standing in the doorway before I could call out. She also never once stood between my father and anything he decided. That's the part I had to make peace with later. The part that took years. What happened when I was 22 was this. I told my father I was not going to marry Derek Paulson. Derek was the son of my father's oldest friend. They'd grown up 2 streets apart, played ball together, built their careers in the same county machinery. My father had been positioning this marriage for years. I understood that later, but at 22 I just knew that Derek was 29 and looked at me like I was a piece of property he hadn't finished paying for yet. There was a dinner. A ring appeared, and I said no. My father didn't yell. That was the thing about him. He never yelled. He just became very still. The way a room becomes still before a storm, and he told me to think carefully about what I was doing. I told him I had thought carefully. He told me I was being foolish and selfish and that I didn't understand how things worked. I told him I understood exactly how things worked, and that was why I was saying no. He gave me 2 weeks to change my mind. I didn't change my mind. 2 weeks later, he sat me down at the kitchen table. My mother was in the other room. I could hear the television. And he told me that as long as I was under his roof and carrying his name, I would not embarrass him like this, and that if I chose to keep embarrassing him, I would need to find somewhere else to be. I was 22 years old. I had a part-time job at a dental office and $340 in a checking account. I looked at my father across that kitchen table and I felt something go very quiet inside me. Not broken, just quiet. I said, "Okay." I packed 2 bags that night. My mother stood in the doorway of my bedroom and watched me fold my clothes, and she didn't say a word. I looked at her once. She looked away. I finished packing and I walked out of that house, and I did not look back at it because I knew if I did, I would not be able to keep walking. I drove to Nashville. I had a college friend there, Ashley, who let me sleep on her couch for 6 weeks while I found a job, and then a room in a shared house, and then, slowly, over the years that followed, an actual life. I waitressed for 2 years, took night classes, talked my way into an entry-level position at a small law firm, and worked every hour they would give me. I got my paralegal certification. I got promoted. I moved into my own apartment with windows that faced east so the morning light came in first thing and reminded me every day that I had gotten somewhere. I met my husband, Preston, at a fundraiser for legal aid 5 years after I left. He was a federal prosecutor. He was the kind of person who asked questions and then actually listened to the answers, and I was not used to that. We talked for 3 hours and he called me the next day, and I told Ashley later that I thought I might be in trouble. She laughed and said good. Preston knew everything about where I came from. I had told him early, one of those late-night kitchen conversations where the wine is gone and the guards come down and you find yourself saying things you haven't said out loud in years. He listened to all of it. He didn't try to fix it or reframe it, or tell me my father probably meant well. He just said, "I'm sorry that happened to you." And then he asked me what I needed. I told him I needed to never go back. He said, "Okay." And for 7 years that was true. The thing about grief is that it doesn't wait for you to be ready. I drove back to Harlan County on a Friday night, Preston beside me in the passenger seat, the Tennessee hills going dark outside the window. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of hollow ache. The ache of a door that never opened and now never would. I had not been back for my mother's birthday. I had not been back for Christmas or Thanksgiving or any of the years that accumulated between then and now. I had told myself that the door was closed from his side, not mine. That when he was ready to treat me like a daughter, I would find a way to be a daughter again. But he had never called. Not once. 11 years, and not one call. Now there would be no call. We checked into a motel outside of town. I wasn't staying in that house, and Preston held my hand in the dark and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. In the morning I put on a black dress and low heels, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. I looked like someone walking into something difficult. I suppose that was accurate. The funeral home was on Maple Street, which I had driven down 1,000 times growing up. The parking lot was already full. My father had been a man with connections, and connections turn out for funerals. There were county commissioners and their wives, men I recognized from City Hall photographs, women from my mother's old church group who had chosen his side when sides were chosen. I got out of the car and I felt every single eye find me. I kept my chin up and walked in. My aunt intercepted me near the entrance. My father's sister, Connie, who had always been kind to me in the way of someone who is kind when the powerful person in the room isn't watching. She squeezed my hands and her eyes were red, and she said she was glad I came. I thanked her for calling me. Then I saw my Uncle Ray. Ray was my father's younger brother, and he had always been the one who handled the things my father needed handled without being asked. He looked at me the way you look at someone who is not supposed to show up. He crossed the room in about 4 seconds. "This is a private service," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear. "I'm his daughter," I said. "You haven't been his daughter in a long time, Lydia." He said my name like he was putting it in quotation marks. He made his wishes clear. "You being here is disrespectful." "To whom?" He straightened up. He was wearing a black suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, and he had the same jaw as my father, and for a moment it was like looking at a photograph I'd tried to throw away. "To this family," he said. "To his memory. He didn't want you here." "He can't want things anymore," I said. That landed. I watched it land, and I felt a small, mean flicker of satisfaction, and then I felt ashamed of it. I stepped around him and took a seat in the third row. The service was 40 minutes long. The pastor talked about my father's service to the community, his dedication to his work, his love of this county and its people. I sat very still and listened to a man be eulogized into someone I did not recognize. At the graveside, I stood slightly apart from the cluster of family, and I watched them lower the casket into the earth, and I said goodbye in my own way, which was quiet and private and mine. And then, just as people were beginning to drift toward the line of cars, Uncle Ray appeared at my side again. This time he had someone with him, a man I didn't know, stocky, maybe 50, with a badge clipped to his belt. Sheriff's Department. "Lydia," Ray said, and his voice had shifted into something more formal. "Your father left explicit documentation barring you from any inheritance claims. We've had his attorney confirm it. I'm asking you, for the last time, to leave peacefully and not pursue this any further." I looked at the badge. I looked at Ray. "I'm not pursuing anything," I said. "I came to my father's funeral." "You've been informed of the situation. If you attempt to contest the will or make any claims against the estate." "Ray." I kept my voice level. "I drove 5 hours to stand at a grave. That's all I'm here for." He nodded slowly like he'd already decided how this was going to go. "Deputy Morrison is going to need to escort you off the property." I stared at him. "You're having me removed from a funeral. From private property." I looked around. People were watching, the connections, the commissioners, the churchwomen. Some of them had known me since I was 7 years old. Not one of them moved. The silence was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of people who had already calculated which way the wind was blowing and positioned themselves accordingly. This, I thought, is what he taught everyone here. This is the world he built. Deputy Morrison put a hand on my arm, and I let him steer me toward the parking lot because I was not going to make a scene at a cemetery. Preston was waiting by the car. He saw my face and straightened up immediately. "They're removing me," I said quietly. Preston looked past me at the deputy. Then he looked at Ray, who had followed at a slight distance, arms crossed. "You're the family representative?" Preston said to Ray. "I am." Preston nodded once. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a credentials wallet, flipped it open, and held it out. Ray's arms uncrossed. "Preston Wallace," my husband said. "Assistant United States Attorney, Eastern District of Tennessee." He put the wallet back in his pocket. "I'm going to need you to take your hand off my wife." Deputy Morrison's hand dropped. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Preston was not there because he had followed me to a funeral to be protective. He was there because 3 months earlier I had gotten a letter, a certified letter, forwarded through 3 different addresses until it finally found me, from a former county employee named Gerald Whitmore. Gerald had worked under my father for 9 years and had been quietly let go 2 years ago. In his letter, Gerald described a pattern of conduct that included falsified property assessments, diverted tax payments, and a network of arrangements that had been benefiting certain landowners and certain bank accounts for the better part of a decade. Gerald had sent the same letter to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Preston had been building the case for 8 months before my father died. My father's death had not closed the case. It had opened the estate. Ray knew none of this. He was standing in a cemetery parking lot looking at a federal prosecutor's credentials and performing a rapid recalculation behind his eyes. "I don't know what you think gives you the right," he started. "The supremacy clause is a good start," Preston said pleasantly. "Also, a grand jury subpoena for the financial records of this estate, which was filed this morning." He let that sit for a moment. "You're welcome to call your attorney. I'll wait." Ray did not call his attorney. Ray looked at me with an expression I had not seen on any face in this family in 11 years. Something close to uncertainty. "We came to bury my father," I said. "That's all I came to do. Everything else is already in motion, and it was in motion before he died, and it has nothing to do with whether I stood at his grave today." I paused. "You should have just let me stand at his grave." I looked out at the cemetery behind us. The crowd had thinned. The gravediggers were at a respectful distance, waiting. Somewhere behind a row of headstones, my father was in the ground, and whatever accounting he owed was no longer something he could negotiate his way out of. I thought about my mother. I thought about the piano on Sunday mornings and the garden out back, and the way she had stood in my bedroom doorway and watched me pack my bags and said nothing. She had died 3 years ago, a stroke, quick, and Connie had called me then too, also too late, and I had sat in my Nashville apartment and cried for the version of my mother that existed in that garden, the one who might have found a way to stand between her daughter and her husband's decisions. I had forgiven her a long time ago for not being that version. Grief is cleaner when you forgive the people you loved for being only human. I had not, until very recently, known what to do with what I felt about my father. Standing there in that parking lot, I thought I might finally know. It wasn't hatred. It had never really been hatred. It was something older and more tired. The grief of a daughter who spent 11 years waiting for a phone call that never came and then ran out of time to wait. "Come on," Preston said beside me, and his hand found mine. We walked back to the car. Connie was standing near the cemetery gate, and she watched us go with an expression I couldn't fully read, part sadness, part something that looked almost like relief. I gave her a small nod. I had come back for one reason, and it wasn't the estate, and it wasn't to watch my father's network crumble under a federal investigation, and it wasn't to win anything. I had come back because 11 years ago I walked out of a house and I never got to say goodbye properly, and I am the kind of person who needs to finish things. I stood at his grave. I said what I needed to say, quietly to myself, in the 11 seconds I had before my uncle decided that even grief was something he could control. That was enough. It turned out to be enough. The investigation took 14 months. I won't pretend I wasn't following it. I was, though I tried to keep some distance, because it wasn't my case and I didn't want my presence anywhere near it to complicate anything Preston's office was doing. What I knew from public filings and from the occasional night when Preston came home from work and sat at the kitchen table with his tie loosened, and that look he gets when something important happened. In the end, Ray was indicted on 4 counts. 2 other men from the county assessor's network were indicted alongside him. A third cooperated. The estate, once the forensic accountants finished with it, was substantially smaller than anyone had presented to the probate court. My father had been moving money for a long time. What remained, after legal fees and restitution orders and the various claims against it, was a 3-bedroom house on a road I used to ride my bike down, and an amount of money that was not life-changing, but was not nothing. I was, legally, an heir. My father's will attempted to exclude me, but there are limits to what a will can do under Tennessee law, and the attorney Ray had retained to manage the estate was no longer in a position to manage anything. I did not keep the money for myself. I donated it to a legal aid organization in Knoxville that provides free representation to low-income clients in family law cases. It felt correct. It felt like turning something that had been used to control people into something that helped people fight back. The house I sold. I did not go back to see it before the sale. I had already been back once, and that was enough. And what I needed to keep from that house, I already had. What I kept was a photograph. Connie had mailed it to me, 3 weeks after the funeral, with a short note that said she hoped I was well. The photograph was of my mother's garden in August, the tomatoes heavy on the vine, the sunflowers along the back fence taller than I remembered them being. My mother is in the corner of the frame, half turned away, her hand raised to shade her eyes from the sun. She is looking at something outside the edge of the photograph. I don't know what she was looking at. I have looked at that photograph 100 times and I still don't know. But there is something in her posture, the slight tilt of her chin, the way she is shielding her eyes like she is searching for something in the distance, that reminds me of myself. It reminds me of every year I spent building something in a city that was not where I came from, looking ahead because looking back hurt too much. It reminds me that she was a woman with her own interior life, her own fears and her own failures, and that she was doing her best with what she had and what she knew. I have made peace with that. Preston found me standing in the kitchen one evening with the photograph in my hands, and he asked me what I was thinking, and I told him I was thinking that the hardest part of all of this was not what my father did, and not the 11 years of silence, and not even being escorted away from a cemetery by a county deputy. The hardest part was learning how to carry a complicated grief, the kind that has no clean ending, no single villain, no moment where you stand in a parking lot and everything resolves. The kind that is just a weight you redistribute over time until one day you realize you've been carrying it so long it's become part of your posture. Preston listened to all of it. He didn't try to fix it. He said, "I know." He put his arms around me and I leaned into him, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the window the Nashville lights were just beginning to come on in the early dark. I had a life. It was mine. I had built every part of it with my own hands, out of the city I had driven to with 340 father and a willingness to not stop moving forward. My father could not take that. He had tried, in his way, to take everything, my autonomy, my choices, my right to sit at a table and say no. He had taken 11 years of ordinary time that we might have had. But he could not take what I had become while he wasn't watching. That was mine. That would always be mine. And that, in the end, was the only vindication that ever really mattered to me. I used to think that the hardest thing about what my father did was the leaving. The 2 bags, the $340, the Nashville couch. But I was wrong. The hardest thing was the waiting. All those years of keeping a door cracked open for someone who had no intention of walking through it. What I understand now, on the other side of all of it, is that the life my father built was held together by control. Not love, not loyalty, control. He controlled the county records, the favors, the alliances, the silence of everyone around him. And when I said no to the one thing he needed me to say yes to, I became a variable he couldn't manage. So he removed me. It was that simple to him. And for 11 years, I let myself believe that said something about my worth. It didn't. It said everything about his fear. There's a version of this story where I came back angry, where I walked into that funeral looking for a fight, wanting to watch something burn. I understand that version. I've met that version of myself in the dark at 2 a.m, going over old conversations in my head. But that's not who I became in those 11 years. And I think that matters. Not because anger is wrong. It isn't. But because I had to decide what I was going to build myself out of. And I chose something sturdier than resentment. Preston always says the most dangerous people in any room are the ones who have nothing to prove. I think about Lydia standing in that parking lot, and I think that's true. I wasn't there to win. I was there to finish something. The federal case had already been in motion for 8 months. Ray's careful manipulation of the estate, the same way my father had manipulated the county for decades. All of it was already unraveling before I ever drove back to Harlan County. I didn't orchestrate that. I just didn't look away from the truth when Gerald's letter arrived, and I didn't pretend that protecting the wrong people was the same as keeping the peace. That's the thing I want to say to anyone who's been told that knowing the truth makes you disloyal. It doesn't. Turning away from what's real in order to make powerful people comfortable. That's not loyalty. That's complicity. And there are consequences to it, not because the universe is punishing anyone, but because unsustainable things eventually collapse under their own weight. My father's network collapsed because it was built on pressure and silence has a shelf life. What lasts is what you build honestly. The paralegal certification I earned at night after long shifts, the apartment with the east-facing windows, the marriage to a man who asks questions and listens to the answers. None of that came from anyone's approval. All of it came from deciding, at 22 years old with 2 bags in my trunk, that I was going to keep moving forward even when I didn't know where forward led. I keep my mother's photograph in the kitchen now, near the window. I look at it in the mornings. She was doing her best with what she had, with what she knew, with the choices that were available to a woman in her position in that particular life. I have made peace with that. What I carry forward from her is the garden. Not literally, but the idea of it. The patience of tending something over time. The belief that what you put into the ground, carefully and consistently, will eventually come up. That's what I know now that I didn't know at 22. Character isn't declared, it's grown. Slowly, in conditions that are not always favorable, in years when nobody is watching and nobody is clapping and you're just showing up anyway because that's who you decided to be. I showed up at my father's funeral. I stood at his grave. I said goodbye. And then I drove home to my life,